Hi, so we are going to continue talking about agriculture and some of the things associated with agriculture, like environmental problems, and ways we control pests and using groundwater and things like that. But one thing that I need to do is go back to organic farming that I talked about in the last video. I neglected to talk about some of the drawbacks of organic farming. So some of the potential problems are listed here. So leaching of nitrates into groundwater. So nitrates obviously are nitrogen-based compounds, and this is a limited nutrient in most ecosystems. And so we add fertilizers to put more nitrogen into soils and allow plants to grow more. So in organic farming, a lot of manure is used as a natural fertilizer, and this contains high levels of nitrate. So there's the potential for these to actually leach down into soils and into groundwater supplies. Another potential issue with organic farming is the large amount of compost that is used. Compost is great, and y'all know that this is something that we are trying to get people involved in at school, but composting on large scale can generate a fair amount of greenhouse gases. And then finally, because organic farmers are not using synthetic herbicides to control weeds, they will use plowing instead if they need to for weed control. And this can add to problems of soil erosion as well as cause a loss of nutrients in soils. All right, so we talked about the first and second green revolutions in the last video, and also this case study with industrialized food production and these few big multinational companies controlling most of the food that we produce and then eat. One thing that I also neglected to talk about last time is meat consumption worldwide. So since about 1974, global meat consumption has more than doubled. Most widely consumed meats are pork, poultry, which includes chicken and turkey, and then beef in order. And meat consumption worldwide will most likely double again by the year 2050 due to growing affluence in developing countries. About half of the world's livestock or meat comes from livestock grazing on grass that is either in enclosed pastures or on rangelands that are unfenced. The other half is produced in factory farms. This is where animals are raised in large numbers in either pens or cages, and we call these feedlots. The entire operation is referred to as a concentrated animal feeding operation, and oftentimes you'll just see CAFO for that, and you should be familiar with that. So these concentrated animal feeding operations are referred to as factory farms. So this is where animals are bred to rapidly gain weight. They're usually fed soy and fish meal and grain, and generally are given large amounts of antibiotics and growth hormones to keep them healthy until they're used. So here, this is just showing you the trend in global meat production, which has grown more than sixfold since 1950. And over here, you can see that the meat consumption in China has actually grown way more than the United States. So it's actually grown ninefold since 1975. Okay, so industrialized food production in general is very taxing. Fossil fuels are really what have made industrialized food production possible. So mostly this includes oil and natural gas. which is used to provide the energy required to run farm machinery, as well as to pump irrigation water, and to also produce the synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that industrialized farmers are using. Another reason that a lot of energy is used in food production is just for transporting food long distances. So that can obviously be on ships, if we're talking globally, or trains and trucks nationally. In the United States, about 17% of all energy that is used is for agricultural practices. So generally this large scale industrial agriculture. This is more than any other industry in the United States. And so it's important to think about this in terms of the life of whatever food product you're talking about. So it takes into account all of the energy required from start to finish. So this would include like planting and getting fields ready, and then planting seeds and growing the plants, and then storing and processing, and then of course transporting the food, and then when it gets into homes, refrigeration, and then the energy required for cooking. So either using natural gas stoves or electric stoves that's utilizing energy. Okay, so we have already talked about genetic engineering in the previous video. Again, I kind of rearranged some slides, so my apologies for that. So let's just get through that. You can refer to the last video for pros and cons of genetically modified foods. So now we need to talk about some of the environmental impacts of industrialized agriculture. Obviously, industrialized agriculture has been great for humans, but it's also had a lot of detrimental environmental impacts, really more than any other activity that we engage in. And obviously, this is bad just when you're thinking about the environment and biodiversity, which we'll talk about, but also a major problem with these impacts are that it can potentially limit, future food production and food security. Okay, so industrialized agriculture has accounted for about 70% of the fresh water that has been removed from surface waters and aquifers, so groundwater worldwide. It uses, I think, 38% of the world's ice-free land, so land that is able to be cultivated, and is also responsible for 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and produces 60% of the world's water pollution. Okay, so you can take some time to look at this on your own. We'll talk about the specifics now. Okay, so we've talked about soil erosion. This is a major problem with industrialized agriculture. So again, I talked about the fact that there is natural soil erosion due to wind and water that we can't control, but our practices are really exacerbating the conditions. And so soil erosion can cause loss of soil fertility. It also can lead to water pollution as sediments are eroded, they can get into waterways and pollute the waters because they have a lot of chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides and things like that. And also, as soil is eroded, carbon that is stored can be released to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Okay, so again, this is just talking about eroded soils getting into streams where organisms can ingest the pesticides, and it can be biomagnified as you move up the food chain. I talked about that previously. Over fertilizing through industrialized agriculture can contaminate drinking water. So if there is a lot of fertilizers used, I talked about this with one of the drawbacks of organic farming, but that was in terms of natural fertilizer or manure. But either way, farming operations, whether it's synthetic or natural fertilizers, can leach nitrates into soils and into groundwater, which can contaminate drinking water supplies. And then again, carbon dioxide emissions are a big problem with agriculture. Okay, so the food that we produce and the biofuel that we use reduces biodiversity. So when forests and grasslands are cleared for crops to be planted, natural biodiversity and ecosystem services are compromised. I mentioned yesterday in class the rainforest in Brazil being cut down, right, for cattle farms and soybean farms. This is an example of, a practice or an agricultural practice that is threatening biodiversity. There is also an increasing loss of what we call agrobiodiversity. So this is the genetic variety of plants and animals that are used on farms, right, to produce the food that we eat. Since about 1900, we've lost about 75% of the genetic diversity of agricultural crops due to using monocultures on industrialized farms. So because we have stopped planting such a variety of foods, we are losing this agrobiodiversity. And this could be detrimental to the need to increase food yields in the future. Here down at the bottom, this is talking about seed banks, which we've talked about previously. But so in an effort to protect the world's food supply, there are about 1,400 refrigerated seed banks that are storing seeds from wild plants and endangered crop varieties. There is something called the Doomsday Vault, which is actually the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and this is on a little island near the North Pole, a Norwegian island, and this seed vault is actually carved out of the permafrost there to keep them cold. But a problem with seed banks is that a lot of seeds can't successfully be stored. Seeds need to be germinated periodically, and then new seeds need to be collected. So it's not like you can just put them in there and forget about them, and our food security is protected for the future. It's an ongoing, time-consuming operation. Okay, so the next sort of problem that we should talk about is dealing with the green revolutions that I mentioned in the last video. So remember, the green revolutions have been important for really increasing food production worldwide. But it's important to know that the green revolutions have really actually been limited in their success due to a variety of factors. So most of the green revolution crops and genetically engineered crops, remember the green revolution crops were like the rice and corn that grow very quickly. But these crops don't actually produce higher yields than traditional strains. And they're also very costly for subsistence farmers, more traditional farmers in less developed countries, because they require large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides and water. Also, eventually with these crops, or just crops in general, it becomes hard to increase yields farther once you hit a certain point, because they can only take up so much fertilizer and water. So you basically get to sort of a wall where you can't go beyond that. And it's also difficult to increase yields through irrigation due to population growth and the limited availability of irrigation water. Also, we talked previously about soil salinization related to irrigation. So this makes it difficult to just say, well, if I water fields more, then I can grow more. Also, again, just a lack of money by the more traditional farmers to pay for extra water. Another problem, and I'm sorry, I know these aren't actually listed on your slides, so you should write these down, and they are in your book. Another limit to green revolutions is climate change, right? So climate change is also expected to limit crop yields. So, for instance, melting glaciers, or glaciers are a source of water for people in China and South America and India. And so with retreating, melting glaciers, this represents a loss of irrigation water. Also, rising sea levels associated with climate change can cause the loss of fertile coastal lands. An example would be the rice growing areas in Asia would be coastal, and there could be a potential loss of that. Also, of course, you can always just think about South Louisiana. So, you know, we grow rice and cotton as well. Also, climate change, or with climate change, there's expected to be increased drought and heat waves. And so this could also cause loss of food supplies, or limit the ability to produce more food for a growing human population. You know, we could potentially increase just the amount of land that we farm on, but already we are experiencing biodiversity loss due to our farming operations, and forest ecosystems are threatened. So if we are talking about clearing more forests to expand our food production, you know, this represents more loss of biodiversity and also will contribute more to climate change and soil erosion problems. One thing that I should also point out when, you know, talking about the pros and cons of genetically engineered foods or genetically modified organisms, some people point to the fact that GM crops could be very important in the future with changing climate conditions, because they can be bred or engineered to be more resistant to drought. So this could be really important with, you know, what we think will probably be worse drought conditions in the future with climate change. Okay, so another problem that we should talk about is problems associated with industrialized meat production. Of course, you know, industrialized meat production has greatly increased meat supplies, which has been good for populations, you know, gaining affluence who are able to purchase these and have this source of protein in their diet. And meat production has actually reduced problems, or industrialized meat production. So like these feedlots that we talked about, or the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, have reduced overgrazing on grasslands, rangelands, and also have helped to keep prices down. But these feedlots and you know, concentrated operations have also lended to both human health and environmental problems. So first of all, it takes a huge amount of water to irrigate the crops that are used to feed the animals. It takes about 450 gallons to produce a quarter-pound hamburger. So 450 gallons of water to produce a small, tiny little patty of meat. Water is really used inefficiently in these operations, and it's adding to problems of groundwater depletion worldwide. Also, a lot of water is used to just wash away the waste from the animals being produced or being raised. This can then cause the waste to get into nearby waterways, which can pollute these aquatic ecosystems. The waste could be recycled as fertilizer, and we'll talk about how it is sometimes, but oftentimes it's contaminated with high levels of antibiotics and also pesticides. So on that note, a lot of animal waste, manure, about half of it is used to fertilize fields. So it's actually sort of sprayed as a sludge over the fields. And even though it is most likely contaminated, like I said, with antibiotics and pesticides, this is a real problem for neighboring communities that have to smell the fertilizer that they're using. And also a lot of the manure is just pumped into lagoons, and this can cause pollution of both groundwater and surface waters if it gets out of the lagoons, like during flooding events. So this was actually a problem up in West Virginia recently. I think it was West Virginia, or maybe it was North Carolina. But with the recent hurricane up on the East Coast, people were really worried about waste escaping from these lagoons and getting into waterways. Also, again, it produces odors and also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, meat production also, as we talked about, requires large amount of energy, mostly oil. Another problem with industrialized meat production is that cows release methane gas. So industrialized meat production is responsible for about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than what our different modes of transportation produce. Another problem is that the antibiotics used on livestock are contributing to contributing to resistance of disease-carrying bacteria. A lot of people choose to buy grass-fed beef, right? Like it's supposed to be a healthier alternative for you. But there are still a lot of problems with grass-fed beef. So one would be that forests are being cut down to make grazing land for this type of cattle. And then this can lend to topsoil erosion and pollution. And then also grass-fed cows actually emit more methane than do grain-fed cows. So I guess think about that next time you go to the store. All right. So here, just advantages and disadvantages of feedlots. You can look at that. We've talked about all of these. Okay, so next video we'll pick up here talking about irrigation and using groundwater, and then we'll move on to pesticides. Bye.